In the grand annals of French history, few names are as historically consequential yet monumentally uncharismatic as King Louis XVI, the king who oversaw the death rattle of absolute monarchy in France. Louis was not a villain, a hero, or a tyrant. He was simply unremarkable, a man of rigid habits, hesitant thoughts, and a passion for locksmithing. Born on August 23, 1754, Louis Auguste was never meant to be king. The third son of the Dauphin of France, he ascended the throne in 1774 at the age of 20, more from tragic family attrition than divine favor. What followed was not a reign of grandeur or terror, but of bewildering mediocrity. He was not born to command, nor did he grow into it. He was, by all accounts, a gentle man with no taste for power, drama, or charisma. Where his predecessor, Louis XV, was known for his debauchery and political intrigue, Louis XVI was known for his early bedtimes and passion for cutting keys. Literally, he maintained a locksmith workshop at Versailles where he would tinker in peace, surrounded by gears, bolts, and the gentle tick of a clock, perhaps the only place where he ever truly ruled. His marriage to Marie Antoinette was the stuff of diplomatic necessity, not passion. The young couple famously took years to consummate their marriage, a subject of gossip and snickering in the pamphlets of the time. And while the Queen became a symbol of excess and frivolity, Louis remained a symbol of nothing much. He rarely took bold stances, deferred decisions to others, and often appeared more interested in his hobbies than his subjects. Even during the stormy build-up to the French Revolution, Louis XVI seemed bewildered by the currents of change. When the Bastille was stormed on July 14, 1789, Louis, upon being informed, reportedly asked, "Is it a revolt?" His advisor replied, "No, sire, it's a revolution." It is perhaps the most dramatic moment in Louis' reign, and even that belonged to someone else. Despite being the head of state during one of the most explosive periods in world history, Louis XVI seemed determined to coast along, lost in the procedural workings of governance. He lacked the Machiavellian instinct of a cunning ruler or the ideological fire of a revolutionary. He was neither feared nor loved, simply tolerated. His attempts at reform were half-hearted and poorly timed. He supported the American Revolution, not out of ideology but as a way to weaken Britain. The financial cost of that support, however, only deepened France's economic woes. When his advisors pleaded for tax reforms, Louis hemmed and hawed. When the Estates General met in 1789, it was the first time it had convened in 175 years, a sign not of his boldness, but of his desperation. In the sessions of the Estates General and the National Assembly, Louis was visibly uncomfortable. He preferred private dinners to public speeches. When he did speak, it was in carefully measured words that offered no surprises. His speeches were written by others and read in a tone so flat it could lull even the most excitable Jacobin to sleep. His escape attempt in 1791, the infamous flight to Varennes, was as uninspiring as the man himself. Disguised poorly and traveling in a large, slow carriage, he was quickly recognized and returned to Paris in disgrace. It was the most action-packed chapter of his life, and it ended in embarrassment. As the revolution gained momentum, the king faded further into the background. In the revolutionary imagination, Marie Antoinette became the villain, while Louis became a ghost. He was put on trial not as a tyrant, but as a symbol of a dead system. His defense was as passive as his rule, respectful, timid, and ultimately futile. On January 21, 1793, he was executed by guillotine. He went to the scaffold with surprising dignity, but without flair. His last words were brief and polite, interrupted by a drum roll. Even in death, the king was not allowed a dramatic exit. King Louis XVI's legacy is not one of fire and blood, but of tepid decisions and missed opportunities. He did not blaze a trail or even try to stop one. He simply watched, confused and overwhelmed, as the world changed around him. In a way, Louis XVI is the perfect example of the boring monarch. Not evil, not brilliant, not cruel, not beloved, just ... A man who found solace in metal keys instead of political ones. A ruler whose greatest enemy was not the revolutionaries, but inertia. And yet, for all his blandness, he remains unforgettable, not for what he did, but for what he failed to do. He is a cautionary tale in passivity, a study in indecision, a king so boring he changed history by accident. In the dim corridors of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, Charles II lingers like a faint echo, a whisper of a monarch whose name appears in textbooks more out of necessity than admiration. If history were a grand stage of personalities and power plays, Charles II would be the weary stagehand stumbling in at the wrong cue, clutching a script he never quite understood. Born on November 6, 1661, in Madrid, Charles entered the world already burdened. His lineage was a parade of cousin marriages that stretched back generations, culminating in a twisted double helix of dynastic decay. He was the son of Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, niece of the king, a relationship so tangled it made the Habsburg jawline a family heirloom. Charles was born physically and mentally impaired, and from the very start his existence was a slow unraveling. Frail, weak, with a lower jaw so pronounced he couldn't chew properly. He was not so much a king in waiting as a patient in waiting. Most historians agree he should never have ruled a kingdom. And yet he ruled Spain and nominally much of the Americas. He didn't walk until he was 4. He spoke with difficulty, suffered seizures, and struggled to learn even basic information. Royal doctors attempted every strange medical practice of the day to strengthen him: bloodletting, potions, holy relics. They prayed, they hoped, but Charles remained caught in a stunted twilight between child and sovereign. Despite all this, he was crowned King of Spain at the age of 4. The regency was handled by his mother, who wielded more power than Charles ever would. From the outset, his rule was overshadowed by palace factions and foreign manipulation. Mariana of Austria, Cardinal Niffard, Don Juan José of Austria, these were the true players, while Charles drifted silently, almost apologetically, through his own reign. He developed few interests, he disliked reading, he avoided music. He had no taste for art, politics, or the pomp of court life. He did, however, exhibit an obsessive fear of witches and demons, and at one point believed he had been bewitched. Priests were summoned to exorcise him. A necropsy performed after his death suggested he suffered from hydrocephalus and multiple organ failures, a testament to the unnatural concentration of Habsburg blood. Charles II was the last of his line, and he ruled during a time when the Spanish Empire was slipping away like sand through an open hand. The once mighty Habsburg dominance had deteriorated into bureaucratic ineptitude, economic decay, and a sense of ghostly inertia. Under Charles, Spain lost influence across Europe, saw its economy shrink, and endured crop failures and starvation. When he married Marie-Louise of Orleans, she was reportedly repulsed by her new husband. Their marriage remained childless, as did his second to Maria Anna of Neuburg. With no heirs, Spain was gripped by a looming crisis. The question of succession became a European obsession. Everyone waited for Charles to die. He did not disappoint them. His daily routine was painfully dull. He woke late, attended Mass, ate in silence, and sat in endless councils where others spoke, and he nodded. He did not write letters. He did not draft laws. He was a living shadow, moved about by his ministers and family, whose agendas shaped the monarchy more than his will ever could. Even in moments of drama, Charles was a background figure. When his second wife attempted to remove his mother from court, Charles did nothing. When the French and Austrian factions schemed to influence the succession, he remained inert. He signed documents he did not read. He agreed to plans he did not comprehend. At one point, a rumor spread that he had already died and that a look-alike had taken his place. The truth may have been even more tragic. Charles was alive, but in all meaningful ways absent. As the 17th century drew to a close, Europe braced for his demise. When he finally died on November 1, 1700, at the age of 38, it was with a sigh of relief rather than grief. His death marked the end of the Spanish Habsburgs and the beginning of the War of the Spanish Succession, a cataclysmic conflict that reshaped Europe. Ironically, the dullest monarch triggered one of the bloodiest wars. In death, as in life, Charles II seemed more symbol than man. He represented the consequences of too much power consolidated in too few hands, the dangers of dynastic inbreeding, and the cost of passive rulership. If monarchy is theater, Charles was the actor who stumbled through every line, missed every cue, and yet still brought down the curtain. Today, Charles II of Spain remains a tragic curiosity, not hated, not heroic, just hopelessly miscast. A monarch who should have been a minor character in the margins of history, but whose sheer incompetence helped bring an empire to its knees. If ever there were a monarch whose reign could be defined not by what he did, but by what he failed to understand, it would be George I of Great Britain. Ascending the British throne in 1714, George Ludwig of Hanover was, quite literally, a foreigner in every sense foreign to the language, the customs, the culture, and most importantly, the interest in actually ruling the kingdom. Born on May 28, 1660, in the small German electorate of Hanover, George was a prince of modest ambition and even more modest charisma. As a member of the House of Hanover, he was a Protestant and thus eligible to inherit the English throne under the Act of Settlement of 1701, which excluded Catholics from succession. The death of Queen Anne, who left no surviving heirs, created a royal vacuum. Out of more than 50 closer blood relatives who were Catholic, George was plucked from obscurity to be crowned King of Great Britain, a country he had never visited and a people he could not understand, and he never really tried. George I arrived in England accompanied by a small army of mistresses, German courtiers, and translators. His English was non-existent. His speeches in Parliament were read by others. At court functions, he smiled politely and said nothing. His cabinet meetings were often held without him, and when he did attend, it was as a silent observer. The language barrier was only the beginning of his disconnect. British customs bewildered him. He preferred German sausages to English roasts, drank schnapps instead of brandy, and conversed mostly in French or Low German. His thick accent and awkward mannerisms made him an object of ridicule in the London press, which caricatured him as a confused, bumbling figurehead. Despite the dramatic political shift from the Stuart monarchy to the Hanoverian dynasty, George I's reign was remarkably uneventful. He delegated nearly every decision to his ministers, particularly Robert Walpole, who emerged as the de facto first prime minister. George may have worn the crown, but it was Walpole who steered the ship. He was neither inspiring nor oppressive, simply indifferent. He had no grand vision for Britain, no sweeping reforms, no defining conflicts, and no memorable speeches. He traveled back to Hanover as often as he could, sometimes for months at a time, treating England as more of a side hustle than a kingdom. When he left, he appointed regents to rule in his place and spent his days hunting and dining in German castles. George's personal life was as uninspiring as his political one. He had married Sophia Dorothea of Celle, but the union was a disaster. After accusing her of infidelity, George locked her away in a remote castle in Ahlden for the rest of her life, never speaking to her again. He surrounded himself with mistresses, most notably Melusine von der Schulenburg, who was granted the absurdly long and equally meaningless title of Duchess of Kendal, Munster, and Brunswick-Lüneburg. He fathered several illegitimate children and maintained a quiet, shadowy domestic life away from the spotlight. Court gossip circulated around his bedroom rather than the throne. Scandalous, perhaps, but even his scandals were dull, played out in hushed tones and behind closed doors. One might expect that such a distant, disengaged monarch would spark rebellion or resistance. But the truth is more disappointing. Most people didn't care. Britain in the early 18th century was more interested in stability than style. George's boring reign was a feature, not a bug. After the drama of the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, the Cromwellian interlude, and the Restoration, people were tired of excitement. George I delivered precisely what they craved, a monarchy that stayed out of the way. His reign saw the rise of party politics, with Whigs and Tories battling in Parliament while George looked on, largely uninterested. He supported the Whigs because they supported him. He offered no ideology, no engagement, and certainly no leadership. In many ways, George I was the first British monarch to embody the principle of constitutional monarchy in its purest form. A king who reigned but did not rule. Even the most dramatic event of his reign, the Jacobite uprising of 1715, unfolded without much involvement from George himself. Led by supporters of the exiled James Francis Edward Stuart, the rebellion sought to restore a Catholic monarch to the throne. It was quickly crushed. George issued proclamations, posed for paintings, and then went back to his German routines. He died on a trip to Hanover in 1727 of a stroke. While crossing the River Leen, he had spent more time in his native land than in the kingdom he was crowned to lead. His body was buried not in Westminster Abbey, but in the family vault in Germany, a final confirmation of where his heart truly lay. George I's legacy is an odd one. He is not remembered for what he did, but for what he didn't do. He didn't invade, he didn't inspire, he didn't oppress. He didn't even try to speak the language. He simply held the throne like a paperweight and moving, uninspiring, and undeniably dull. And yet, in this dullness, there was transformation. By refusing to rule, he allowed Parliament to govern. By not interfering, he gave birth to modern British democracy. He may have been boring, but his boredom became the bedrock of a new era. History remembers Frederick the Great, the fierce military tactician and enlightened despot who forged Prussia into a European power. But before him, there was Frederick I, less a great man, more a placeholder. The founder of the Kingdom of Prussia in title, but not in spirit, Frederick I was a monarch whose most dramatic moment involved placing a crown on his own head, and then returning to administrative tedium with all the enthusiasm of a man filling out tax forms. Born as Friedrich III of Brandenburg on July 11, 1657, he was the son of Frederick William, the Great Elector. His father had carved Brandenburg Prussia into a respectable power through clever diplomacy and military modernization. The younger Frederick inherited not only this legacy but also the impossible task of living up to it. And he failed not spectacularly, but rather in the most forgettable, flatline kind of way. Where his father was energetic, calculating, and shrewd, Frederick was obsessed with titles, pomp, and the intricacies of court etiquette. His chief ambition was not military conquest or state reform, but to be called king. He yearned for monarchical legitimacy in a Europe dominated by hereditary sovereigns. At the time, Prussia was technically a duchy under Polish suzerainty, and Brandenburg was part of the Holy Roman Empire. Frederick's patchwork of territories gave him power but not prestige. That would not do. He spent years lobbying the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I for royal recognition. In exchange for military support against the French during the War of the Spanish Succession, the emperor agreed. The deal was steeped in legal hair-splitting. Frederick could call himself king in Prussia, not king of Prussia, since much of the land he controlled wasn't technically sovereign. So, on January 18, 1701, in the snow-covered halls of Königsberg, Frederick crowned himself king in Prussia. It was a theatrical moment designed to mirror the coronations of Europe's great monarchs. He wore ermine robes, a bejeweled crown, and performed the ritual without a pope, archbishop, or any religious grandeur. The entire spectacle was awkwardly splendid, self-important, overly choreographed, and largely ignored by the powers that mattered. After the coronation, nothing changed. The army remained small. The bureaucracy continued to run on the inertia of his father's reforms. Frederick was more concerned with palace designs than policy. He built Charlottenburg Palace as a monument to Baroque splendor, adorning it with gold leaf and crystal chandeliers while the country's coffers drained. The kingdom may have been young, but its king ruled as though his throne were upholstered in molasses. Frederick's court was a curious hybrid of stifling formality and domestic banality. He imported French customs, mimicked Versailles, and hosted theatrical performances often poorly attended. His wife, Sophia Charlotte, was an intellectual powerhouse, beloved for her wit and scholarship. She surrounded herself with thinkers and scientists, most of whom preferred her company over the king's. Frederick, for his part, stayed in his lane managing his wardrobe, tweaking ceremonial schedules and collecting titles like a bureaucratic magpie. Foreign policy under Frederick I was a masterpiece in caution. He allied with Austria, then distanced himself. He joined the War of the Spanish Succession and contributed troops, but never took command. He signed treaties, offered condolences, and issued decrees, most of them written by others and rubber-stamped with royal indifference. His military reputation was a ghost. He inherited a well-organized army but showed no flair for strategy or interest in leading. Generals operated autonomously, and the king contented himself with parades and medals. He loved uniforms and commissions but avoided the grit of actual warfare. In a century defined by continental conflict, Frederick I remained on the sidelines, polishing the silverware. Even his interactions with contemporaries were lackluster. He was overshadowed by figures like Peter the Great, who stormed Europe with reformist fire, and Louis XIV, who embodied absolutist grandeur. Frederick, meanwhile, preferred letter writing and ceremonial banquets. Diplomats left his court with the impression not of majesty, but of mild tedium. His reign was not without achievements, but they came from inertia, not innovation. He expanded the arts, yes, but through patronage, not passion. He stabilized Prussian administration, but only by maintaining what already existed. He didn't break systems. He didn't build them. He simply preserved them in amber. When he died in 1713, the general sentiment was relief. His son, Frederick William I, known as the Soldier King, would go on to reshape Prussia into a disciplined military state. Where Frederick I had dawdled, his son drilled. Where he adorned, Frederick William organized. It was a generational shift from rococo to rigor. Frederick I's tomb lies in Berlin, beneath gilded arches and silent marble. But even his resting place feels slightly overdecorated for a man whose primary legacy is bureaucracy wrapped in brocade. He crowned himself not out of necessity, but out of vanity. And having done so, he spent the rest of his reign floating in the ceremonial ether. He is remembered, if at all, for what he wanted to be, not what he was. The king who anointed himself, staged his own triumph, and then settled into an unremarkable monarchy. No wars, no reforms, no revolutions. Just candlelit salons and velvet thrones. A monarch who made history not with a bang, but with a yawn. Christian VII of Denmark was not a tyrant, nor a savior, nor a statesman. He was, quite possibly, the strangest absentee monarch Europe ever produced, a man who physically occupied the throne but mentally wandered far from the affairs of state. Born on January 29, 1749, Christian was thrust into a crown he never desired, a marriage he never comprehended, and a role he was wholly unequipped to play. He is remembered less for his policies and more for his peculiar habits, his affection for puppet theaters, his obsession with masturbation, and his lifelong descent into mental disarray. The signs were apparent early. From childhood, Christian displayed emotional instability, bursts of paranoia, and unpredictable behavior. His education, supervised by austere Lutheran tutors, emphasized memorization and obedience, not thought or creativity. The more they drilled structure into him, the more he unraveled. He was prone to tantrums, compulsive behavior, and disturbing episodes of disassociation. Some historians believe he suffered from schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder, though no diagnosis can be confirmed retroactively. When he ascended to the throne in 1766 at the age of 17, his subjects hoped for reform and renewal. What they got was a monarch so detached that foreign envoys described him as a shell. He would giggle inappropriately, mimic courtiers, and make faces during official ceremonies. While most monarchs buried emotion behind royal decorum, Christian VII had no such filters. He would compulsively wash his hands for hours, talk to himself, and disappear for days into his private puppet theater, an ornate miniature stage where he acted out imagined dramas far more engaging than real governance. His marriage to Caroline Matilda of Great Britain was doomed from the outset. She was young, intelligent, and full of hope. Christian was erratic, emotionally distant, and psychologically errant. Though the marriage produced a son, Frederick VI, Christian remained disinterested in both his wife and his child. He preferred the company of his valet, Enevold Brandt, and his personal physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee. And it was Struensee who, for a brief, strange time, became the true ruler of Denmark. Appointed royal physician in 1768, Struensee quickly became Christian's confidant, caretaker, and puppet master. He encouraged Christian's eccentricities, medicated his mood swings, and eventually used his influence to seize power. With Christian's signature, Struensee issued more than 1,000 decrees, enacting Enlightenment-style reforms, abolishing torture, modernizing the judicial system, promoting public health, and curbing aristocratic privilege. These reforms were progressive, even radical, but they were not Christians. The king, barely conscious of his own kingdom, served as a blank slate upon which Strunzi scribbled modernity. Christian spent these years adrift in distraction, wandering the palace halls, observing puppet shows, and compulsively engaging in bizarre rituals. At court functions, he would sometimes leap from his chair and flee the room. His handlers created a rotating schedule to manage his moods. Ministers plotted in whispers while Christian talked to imaginary friends. Meanwhile, Strunzi began an affair with Queen Caroline Matilda, and the court erupted in scandal. The queen gave birth to a daughter, believed by many to be Strunzi's. Conservative nobles and the Queen Dowager Juliana Maria saw their chance. In 1772, they staged a palace coup. Strunzi was arrested, tortured, and executed. Caroline Matilda was banished. Christian VII, the puppet king, remained on the throne but now under new management. From that point onward, the king was little more than a symbolic figurehead. His mental condition worsened. He withdrew further from public life, living in a dreamscape of rituals and compulsions. Ministers ruled in his name, his son was raised by others, and the affairs of state proceeded without his input. A council led by his half-brother ruled in his stead, with Christian occasionally wheeled out for public ceremonies like a porcelain relic from a bygone era. His court became a theater of absurdity. Musicians played to empty halls because the king refused to enter. Portraits of him were painted from memory because he could not sit still. Visitors described the eerie silence of his wing in the palace, interrupted only by muttering and sudden outbursts. His routines were monitored, controlled, and managed like a dangerous but beloved pet. And yet, amid all the tragedy, Christian VII's reign saw more progressive change than many of his mentally sound predecessors. Thanks to Strunzi, Denmark took halting steps toward the Enlightenment. These reforms, though largely reversed after the coup, left an imprint. But Christian himself understood none of it. He was a monarch in name only, like a wax figure on a carousel, eternally turning but going nowhere. He died in 1808 at the age of 59 after decades of ghostly half-life. His son, Frederick VI, who had served as regent for years, officially took over. The legacy of Christian VII is not one of tyranny, vision, or courage. It is one of absence. He was a king whose presence created a vacuum so vast others rushed to fill it with ideas, with plots, with dreams. Christian VII is a sobering reminder of how power can be worn like an empty robe. A king in name, but a puppet in truth. His reign was a long act of performance, where the performer forgot the lines and wandered offstage. If the Spanish Empire were a grand galleon, then Philip III was the captain who spent most of the voyage in his quarters, leaving the ship to sail or sink on its own. Ruling from 1598 to 1621, Philip III of Spain might best be remembered as the king who simply didn't show up to his own reign. Passive, pious, and perplexingly absent, Philip allowed his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, to steer the mighty Spanish Empire toward a slow, dignified drift into irrelevance. Born on April 14, 1578, Philip III inherited the most powerful empire in the world from his father, Philip II, the same Philip who had ruled over Spain's Golden Age, the Armada, and vast colonial possessions. But where Philip II was dour and diligent, Philip III was soft-spoken, mild, and indecisive. His education was tailored to form a pious Catholic monarch, not a shrewd politician. And so, Philip III grew up more comfortable with priests than with ministers, and more attuned to religious ritual than the realities of statecraft. From the outset, Philip displayed little interest in governing. He viewed the royal role as a ceremonial and moral one, not an executive function. Within the first year of his reign, he entrusted most of the administration to his childhood friend Francisco Gómez de Sandoval y Rojas, the Duke of Lerma, a man more interested in enriching himself than in reforming the state. The court quickly became a hotbed of favoritism, corruption, and self-congratulation. Lerma ran Spain like a private business. He appointed cronies, sold offices, and funneled resources into his personal fortune. He encouraged the king's detachment, creating an echo chamber where decisions were made behind closed doors and rubber-stamped by a monarch, more concerned with etiquette than empire. Philip III rarely attended council meetings. He preferred long religious retreats, court entertainments, and the placid rituals of monarchy. During his reign, Spain's economic decline continued. The state was bankrupt multiple times. Inflation soared, exacerbated by the endless flow of silver from the Americas, which the crown mismanaged with uncanny consistency. Instead of investing in infrastructure or industrialization, Spain sank its wealth into endless war and court luxuries. And while Europe burned in conflict and reform, Philip III sat quietly, praying, fasting, and enjoying the occasional hunt. One of the most infamous episodes of his reign was the expulsion of the Moriscos. In 1609, descendants of Muslim converts to Christianity who had lived in Spain for centuries. The decision, encouraged by religious zealots and sanctioned by Lerma, displaced nearly 300,000 people, many of whom were productive farmers and artisans. It was one of the most economically self-destructive decisions in Spanish history, executed without protest from the king, who reportedly considered it a moral triumph. Philip III was, in theory, king of not just Spain, but Portugal, Naples, Sicily, and vast territories in the Americas and the Low Countries. Yet he seemed blissfully unaware of how these lands functioned. His foreign policy was largely reactionary and dictated by others. Spain became involved in the 30 Years' War in its early stages, committing to Catholic alliances without a coherent strategy. Victories were rare, defeats expensive. Culturally, the reign was paradoxically rich. The Spanish Golden Age of art and literature continued to flourish with figures like Lope de Vega, El Greco, and Cervantes working during this time. But this cultural brilliance existed despite the monarchy, not because of it. The king did little to promote or encourage the arts, and even less to understand their political potential. Philip's personal life was devoid of drama. He married Margaret of Austria, a pious woman who shared his religious devotion. They had 8 children, and their court was considered scandal-free by the standards of European monarchies. But what it lacked in scandal, it made up for in tedium. The court of Philip III was a place of stiff protocol, endless ceremonies, and somber observances. Even the architecture of his reign reflected this mediocrity. Under Lerma's influence, the court was moved from Madrid to Valladolid in 1601, an expensive, unnecessary relocation that served no strategic purpose. In 1606, the court moved back, costing the empire more money and providing no clear benefit. It was governance by whim, with no one at the helm. In the final years of his reign, cracks began to show. Lerma, once untouchable, was accused of corruption by rivals and eventually dismissed in 1618. His own son, the Duke of Uceda, helped engineer his downfall. But even in this moment of political intrigue, Philip III remained aloof. He let it unfold with barely a comment, like a spectator at a play whose plot he no longer followed. He died on March 31, 1621, of a fever, surrounded by clergy, candles, and courtly silence. One story claims that his death was hastened, because his attendants refused to move him from the heat of a brazier due to strict court protocol. It is perhaps the perfect image of Philip III's reign, a king too constrained by formality to act, even in the face of fire. Philip III's legacy is one of passive decay. He did not destroy the Spanish Empire, but he certainly did nothing to save it. He let others rule, let crises unfold, let opportunities slip away. In his stillness, Spain's decline accelerated. In the pantheon of boring monarchs, Philip III stands tall not because he lacked power, but because he never bothered to wield it. His was a reign of shadows and whispers, not declarations or victories. He was a king who reigned by default, delegated by habit, and vanished into the furniture of his own palace. If Ferdinand IV of Naples had been born a fisherman, he might have lived a content and uneventful life. But as fate would have it, he was born into the Bourbon dynasty, destined to rule southern Italy, and he spent nearly 6 decades, doing so with the enthusiasm of a man stuck in a job he never applied for. His reign was long, muddled, reactive, and above all, defined by a breathtaking disinterest in ruling. Born on January 12, 1751, to Charles III of Spain and Maria Amelia of Saxony, Ferdinand became King of Naples and Sicily at the age of 8. when his father abdicated the southern thrones to become King of Spain. A child on the throne was hardly unique in European history, but Ferdinand never really grew into the crown. He remained awkward, poorly educated, and more at home with hunting dogs than diplomats. From the very beginning, governance was delegated to others. A regency council managed affairs until Ferdinand came of age, but even as an adult, he preferred fishing and manual labor to statecraft. Ministers and foreign advisors dominated the court, shaping policy while Ferdinand explored the woods or mumbled through religious observances. His tutors described him as inattentive, easily bored, and confused by basic arithmetic. Married to Maria Carolina of Austria, the sister of Marie Antoinette, Ferdinand found himself paired with a woman far more intelligent and politically engaged than he would ever be. She effectively ran the show, appointing ministers, influencing alliances, and cultivating Enlightenment ideals. Ferdinand, meanwhile, delighted in practical jokes and street food. He would wander the city incognito to observe the commoners, a habit praised by some and mocked by many more. When the French Revolution broke out, the Bourbon dynasty across Europe reeled in fear. Ferdinand's reaction was less fear and more inertia. Despite being married to an Austrian archduchess and cousin to Louis XVI, he responded to the chaos in France with bafflement and confusion. Maria Carolina pushed Naples into the first coalition against France, while Ferdinand barely understood the war his kingdom was fighting. In 1798, French forces invaded Naples and the Parthenopan Republic was declared. Ferdinand fled to Sicily, disguised as a sailor, leaving behind his palace, his court, and any illusion that he was capable of protecting his throne. The Republic was short-lived, lasted just 6 months, but his hasty retreat earned him the reputation of a cowardly king. After British Admiral Horatio Nelson helped him regain control, Ferdinand returned not with the grace of a restored monarch, but with the moodiness of a man forced to do something unpleasant. He ruled Naples like a landlord inspecting storm damage, begrudgingly, sporadically, and with no real plan. He re-established the monarchy and executed many republicans. But these decisions came not from conviction, but from pressure by advisors and Maria Carolina. The early 19th century brought more turmoil. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise forced Ferdinand to flee Naples again in 1806, when the French installed Joseph Bonaparte on the Neapolitan throne. Once again, Ferdinand escaped to Sicily, once again abandoning the capital without much resistance. In Sicily, the British helped establish a constitutional government to prevent a French takeover. Did Ferdinand embrace this new political structure? Not quite. He tolerated it the way one tolerates a neighbor's barking, dog loudly, grudgingly, and with occasional threats. He spent the war years in Sicily, aging gracelessly, becoming more irritable, superstitious, and increasingly irrelevant. He distrusted intellectuals, shunned liberal ideas, and longed for the simple pleasures of his youth. Maria Carolina died in 1814, and by then, Ferdinand had no real appetite for power or reform. When Napoleon fell and the Congress of Vienna restored the Bourbon monarchy, Ferdinand returned to Naples, yet again older, crankier, and still wholly uninterested in governance. In 1816, he merged Naples and Sicily into the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and crowned himself Ferdinand, the first of the newly unified realm. But the name change did little to rejuvenate his leadership. He ruled like an absentee landlord, delegating to reactionary ministers and crushing any whiff of constitutionalism. Secret police multiplied, censorship returned, and political dissidents were imprisoned en masse not through the king's strategy, but through his lazy indifference. The machine of state turned without him, grinding opponents under the weight of bureaucracy and Bourbon fear. Ferdinand died on January 4, 1825. Having ruled for nearly 60 years longer than many far more capable kings. His reign was marked not by visionary leadership or dramatic tyranny, but by avoidance. He avoided war when possible. He avoided decisions when plausible. And he avoided responsibility almost constantly. He was not cruel, exactly, nor was he wise. He was simply absent, emotionally, intellectually, politically, a monarch who preferred sausages to sovereignty, hunting dogs to history, and leisure to law. In the catalogue of boring monarchs, Ferdinand IV of Naples is a masterclass in mediocrity. He did not lose his thrones through failure, nor win them back through brilliance. He simply outlasted everyone, and in doing so, proved that sometimes the most boring kings are the ones who never try to be anything else. If the emperor is the voice of a nation, then Taisho was Japan's whisper. Born on August 31st, 1879, as Yoshihito, the son of Emperor Meiji, he lived during a time of radical modernization and military ascendance in Japan. Yet his own reign, from 1912 to 1926, would be one of muted presence and delegated power, a constitutional emperor in theory, but a spectral figure in practice. By the time Yoshihito ascended the throne as Emperor Taisho, the Japanese Empire had already transformed dramatically. His father, Emperor Meiji, had led Japan's leap into modernity, casting aside centuries of feudal rule for a new industrial and imperial order. But the crown Taisho inherited came with shadows, most notably the legacy of a brilliant and powerful predecessor. And from the beginning, it was clear that Yoshihito could not follow in those footsteps. His childhood was marked by illness. A bout of meningitis left lasting effects on his physical and possibly mental development. He struggled with coordination, suffered chronic fatigue, and often exhibited erratic behavior. Rumors swirled around his mental state for much of his life. Courtiers noted his difficulty in learning, his discomfort in public ceremonies, and his tendency to repeat strange gestures. He was, as historians often phrase it delicately, unsuited to rule, and yet he did. When his father died in 1912, Taisho took the throne, but not the spotlight. Within just a few years, his health declined to the point where he could barely perform his duties. In 1919, he was effectively removed from public life. By 1921, his son Hirohito was appointed regent, making Taisho perhaps the most invisible living monarch in modern Japanese history. During Taisho's reign, Japan participated in major international events: World War I, the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, and the Washington Naval Conference. It expanded its empire and strengthened its military. But Taisho had no say in any of it. Foreign policy, domestic reform, and military decisions were all handled by the Diet and the general, while Taisho faded into the imperial architecture. Unlike Meiji, who was painted in bold strokes of tradition meets modernity, Taisho became an afterthought. He was not beloved or hated. He was not inspiring or scandalous. He simply existed. His public appearances became rare, and when they occurred, they were often awkward. One famous anecdote tells of a parliamentary opening where Taisho rolled his speech into a telescope and peered through it at his audience instead of reading it. The act became a metaphor for his reign, seeing, perhaps, but never truly speaking. His court was quiet, conservative, and ceremonial. There were no sweeping decrees, no philosophical writings, no personal ambition for reform. Taisho's reign was not a clash of ideologies, but a sigh. The real power lay in the hands of politicians like Prime Minister Hara Takashi, who oversaw Japan's shift toward democratic politics. The era even became known as the Taisho democracy, a curious irony, given how little the emperor himself contributed to it. In many ways, Taisho's absence enabled progress. Without a domineering monarch at the helm, the civilian government expanded its authority. The Diet gained influence. Political parties grew in number and power. It was a period of liberalization and expansion despite, not because of, the emperor. His family life was stable, if quiet. He married Empress Taimai, a steady and respected figure who took on many ceremonial duties in his stead. Together they had 4 sons, including Hirohito, the future Emperor Shua. Taimai became the de facto public face of the imperial household, while Taisho remained behind the curtain. Taisho died on December 25, 1926, after years of seclusion. His funeral was modest compared to his father's, and public sentiment reflected a muted reverence. He had not disgraced the throne, but he had not defined it either. In Japanese history, Taisho is a transitional figure. He bridged the age of samurai modernism under Meiji and the militaristic fervor under Hirohito. His reign was a pause between storms, a still moment in a turbulent century. And in that stillness, there is something oddly powerful. For a monarch to matter by not mattering, that is the legacy of Taisho. In the annals of forgotten royalty, few figures embody the haunting silence of monarchy, quite like King Otto of Bavaria. Crowned but never ruling, named but never heard. Otto's reign was not a story of tyranny, wisdom, or even mediocrity. It was a tale of prolonged disappearance. He reigned from 1886 to 1913 in title only, locked away in royal seclusion as his kingdom moved forward without him. A king in name, a ghost in practice. Born on April 27, 1848, Otto Friedrich Ludwig was the younger brother of Ludwig II, the famed Mad King of Bavaria who built fairy tale castles and drowned in myth. Otto's life was destined to be quieter, so quiet, in fact, that by the time he ascended the throne, he hadn't spoken publicly in years. After serving in the Franco-Prussian War, Otto returned home psychologically unwell. Reports described his behavior as erratic, paranoid, and increasingly detached from reality. Official diagnoses included severe depression and hallucinations, conditions not well understood at the time, but enough to deem him unfit to rule. When Ludwig II was deposed in 1886, Otto became king by default. But his reign began under a cloud of secrecy and mental illness. He was immediately placed under medical supervision at Schloss Fürstenried, a palace-stern sanatorium outside Munich. For the next 27 years, Otto would remain there, guarded by attendants, monitored by physicians, and hidden from his subjects. He never issued a proclamation. He never gave a speech. He never held court. He never even sat on his throne. Instead, governance fell to his uncle, Prince Luitpold, who ruled as Prince Regent for over 2 decades. Luitpold became the real ruler of Bavaria, balancing a conservative court with cautious liberal reforms. The people came to regard Luitpold as their monarch in all but name. Otto remained a shadow on the margins, whispered about but rarely seen. The strange fiction of Otto's kingship persisted through a peculiar legal arrangement. His name appeared on coins. His image adorned official documents. State acts were issued in his name, but always with the asterisk of regency. It was a monarchy built on silence, a national secret maintained through bureaucratic sleight of hand. Visitors to Fürstenried described Otto as quiet and withdrawn, often speaking to himself or refusing to engage at all. He would pace for hours or sit in complete stillness. Some days he believed he was being poisoned. Other days he thought he was in exile. His caretakers spoke gently to him, maintained his schedule, and ensured he remained dignified in his isolation. He wore royal clothing, dined on fine meals, and lived in luxurious confinement, but he had no idea what was happening in his kingdom. The irony of Otto's reign is profound. In an era of rising nationalism, expanding suffrage, and mounting international tensions, Bavaria's king was silent. As the world modernized around him, Otto stood still, locked in the amber of his own mind. Newspapers speculated on his condition, but official silence prevailed. His reign became a symbol of monarchical absurdity, a king without voice, will, or power. In 1912, Prince Luitpold died and was succeeded by his son, Prince Ludwig, who continued as regent. But even this fiction could not last. In 1913, with World War I looming and political pressure mounting, Ludwig deposed Otto and declared himself King Ludwig III. Otto, unaware of the change, remained in his palace. No resistance was offered, no abdication was signed. The silent king simply faded further into history. Otto died on October 11, 1916, in the same seclusion he had known for nearly his entire adult life. His funeral was public, but somber. Few remembered his voice. Fewer still remembered his rule. He was buried alongside his brother. The mad dreamer Ludwig II, a pair of tragic monarchs, defined not by action, but by absence. Otto's legacy is not one of scandal or destruction. It is one of stillness. He was a monarch not because he wanted to be, but because law and bloodline said he must. He reigned not through decree, but through ghostly formality. His kingship was a ritual, a performance without an actor. In a time when monarchs struggled to remain relevant in an age of democracy and war, Otto stood apart not as a failure, but as a silence too deep to break. History is often marked by grand figures who shaped nations, wielded power, and left lasting legacies. But sometimes, history's most poignant tales are not of triumph, but of tragic brevity. John I of France, often forgotten, is the monarch who never truly reigned, a newborn who was king for barely 5 days before slipping quietly into oblivion, making his reign perhaps the shortest and most uneventful in royal history. John I was born on November 15, 1316, in the dead of winter at the Château de Vincennes near Paris. His birth was heralded with hope and anxiety because his father, Louis X, had died just months earlier, leaving no clear male heir. The kingdom was gripped by uncertainty. Louis X's widow, Clementia of Hungary, was pregnant, and all eyes were on her to deliver the future king. When John was born, the crown passed immediately to him, but the fragility of the infant king cast a shadow over the realm. From the very moment of his birth, John's life was precarious. Medieval medicine, particularly regarding newborn care, was rudimentary at best. The infant king was placed under the care of royal midwives and attendants, but his survival was uncertain. The kingdom, meanwhile, was ruled by a regency council, tasked with protecting the infant monarch and maintaining order. Despite the regal title and the pomp of coronation rituals, John I never took steps toward governance. He was, quite simply, a baby, helpless, voiceless, and unaware of the enormous expectations placed upon him. The regents managed political affairs in his name, dealing with rival factions and preparing for the possibility of his demise. Tragically, that outcome came swiftly. John died on November 20, 1316, just 5 days after his birth. The exact cause of death remains a mystery, but in an era of high infant mortality, especially among premature or weak newborns, the loss was sadly common. His death threw the kingdom into a new crisis. Who would succeed him? The crown then passed to his uncle, Philip V, who swiftly took power. Yet Philip's claim was contested, and the succession led to a bitter dispute known as the 100 Years' War's early political tension, partly fueled by questions over legitimacy and Salic law, which barred women from inheriting the throne. John I's brief existence was a footnote in the grand saga of the medieval France, a phantom monarch whose reign was no reign at all. His life encapsulates the fragility of dynastic succession in a brutal age where life was precarious and political fortunes could hinge on a single breath. Though his time was fleeting, John I's story remains a somber reminder of monarchy's human face, a newborn burdened with the weight of an entire kingdom, who left behind nothing but silence. In the pantheon of English kings, few reigns were as tragic and passive as that of Henry VI, a monarch so unfit for rule that his piety became a liability. Born into the royal lineage during the 100 Years' War, and crowned both King of England and France before he could speak, Henry's legacy is not of glory or conquest but of mental collapse, chronic indecision, and a life buried under religious devotion and dynastic disaster. If ever there was a monarch too gentle for the brutal world of politics, it was Henry VI. Henry was born on December 6, 1421, the only son of the legendary warrior King Henry V and Catherine of Valois, a French princess. His birth was overshadowed by war and the death of his father less than a year later. At just 9 months old, Henry became King of England, and shortly thereafter, the French declared him King of France, as well, an enormous burden for a child barely out of infancy. England's ruling elite placed their hopes in the promise of a divine monarch who would continue his father's victorious legacy. But from an early age, Henry showed signs that he was anything but a warrior. While his predecessors had swung swords and conquered territories, Henry preferred monasteries over military camps, prayers over policies, and quiet reflection over council meetings. Throughout his early reign, power was wielded by regents and advisors. As he came of age, England hoped for a king ready to assert himself, but Henry had no appetite for governance. He was more interested in endowing religious houses, founding educational institutions like Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, and surrounding himself with confessors and friars. His moral compass was unwavering, but so was his inability to lead. Henry was, by all accounts, meek to the point of paralysis. He disliked conflict, avoided punishment even for rebels, and could not manage his powerful nobles. England, already fragile from decades of war in France, began to splinter under the pressure of internal divisions. Into this vacuum of power stepped Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry's ambitious wife. She was fierce, political, and determined to keep the Lancastrian cause alive. Especially after Henry's shocking mental collapse in 1453, this collapse was not a brief affliction. Henry entered a catatonic state for over a year, unable to speak, move, or recognize those around him. Many historians suspect he suffered from a hereditary mental illness, possibly inherited from his grandfather Charles VI of France, who infamously believed he was made of glass. During Henry's episodes, the realm was essentially leaderless. Power fell into the hands of Margaret and her faction, which only intensified the rivalries at court. The stage was now set for civil war, the infamous Wars of the Roses, a dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York. Henry, ever passive, was little more than a pawn in the struggle. He was captured, imprisoned, rescued, recaptured, dragged back and forth like a relic of legitimacy while others fought in his name. During his reign, England lost all its territories in France except Calais, and the country dissolved into bloody, factional warfare. To make matters worse, Henry's son, Prince Edward, was a child of war, born in the middle of the dynastic feud and raised to reclaim the throne. But Edward was killed in battle in 1471, and with him died any hope of Henry's line continuing. Shortly after, Henry VI was quietly murdered, most likely on the orders of Edward IV, the victorious Yorkist king. He died in the Tower of London, possibly smothered, possibly beaten, and certainly forgotten by most of the kingdom. Henry's legacy is curious. He was pious, charitable, and sincerely devout, a gentle soul in a brutal age. But monarchy is not a sanctuary, and piety does not translate to power. His inability to govern, his mental instability, and his avoidance of conflict doomed his reign to chaos. England, under Henry's nominal rule, experienced some of its most violent and anarchic years. Even his acts of charity, while noble, couldn't mask the absence of leadership. He was a king who prayed while his kingdom burned, a monarch who abdicated not by force, but by inertia. His reign was not one of cruelty or tyranny, but a vacancy, a blank space at the top of a crumbling hierarchy. In modern times, some have tried to paint Henry VI as a saintly figure, a martyr of sorts. And while he was canonized informally by some in the decades following his death, the truth is less romantic. He was not holy so much as hopeless, not tragic so much as lost. The throne demanded action, but Henry only offered abstention. Where other kings were tyrants or generals, he was a spectator in a seat of power, lost in thought while the real world marched past him. Today, Henry VI is often forgotten, overshadowed by his father's victories and his rival's power plays. But his story is essential in understanding that not all kings shape history through will or warfare. Some, like Henry, shape it through absence, by failing to act, failing to lead, and becoming symbolic ghosts of what might have been. A king of prayers, not policy. A monarch of silence in an age of screams. For nearly 1,000 years, the Holy Roman Empire loomed over Central Europe like a grand, ramshackle chandelier glittering in title, held together by history and teetering under its own weight. And then came Emperor Franz II, the man who, with a weary sigh and a deliberate hand, switched off the light. His was not a reign of brilliance, nor infamy, nor even tyranny. Franz II's legacy is defined by something far more understated: resignation. He didn't burn the empire down. He simply stepped back and watched it fade. Born in 1768, Franz came from the prestigious and notoriously inbred house of Habsburg-Lorraine, a dynasty that practically invented the phrase "married to power." His family ruled over Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, and of course, the tangled patchwork of states that made up the Holy Roman Empire, a loose confederation of hundreds of duchies, bishoprics, and mini-monarchies, more ceremonial than sovereign. Franz ascended the throne in 1792, a year seething with revolution. France had executed its king and was marching under the banner of liberty, equality, fraternity. Monarchs across Europe trembled, and none more so than Franz, whose aunt, Marie Antoinette, met her end at the guillotine. As the world turned, Franz stood rooted to the floor in full imperial regalia, hoping if he simply stayed still, the future might pass him by. Unfortunately for Franz, Napoleon Bonaparte had no such intentions. During Franz's reign, the French emperor steamrolled through Europe, redefining borders and kingdoms with the fury of modern warfare. Franz's reaction was predictable, not bold action but careful retreat. Time and again he tried to preserve his dignity with half measures and rebranding efforts. In 1804, sensing that the Holy Roman Empire was on its deathbed, he preemptively crowned himself Emperor of Austria, a new title for an old family, like slapping fresh paint on a crumbling cathedral. 2 years later, Napoleon crushed the imperial armies at Austerlitz, forcing Franz's hand. In 1806, with the French emperor erecting his own puppet confederation of the Rhine, Franz did what no Holy Roman emperor had done in a millennium. He dissolved the empire. There was no fanfare, no last-ditch battle, no weeping crowds or burning capitals, just a signed declaration. 1,000 years of quasi-imperial rule snuffed out in a legal document penned in a quiet office in Vienna. But perhaps it was fitting. The Holy Roman Empire had long been a hollow crown. Voltaire famously quipped that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, and by Franz's time, that had become less insult and more accurate description. The emperor could no longer command the loyalty of his electors or enforce uniform laws. The empire existed by inertia, and Franz simply became the man who acknowledged the obvious. From that point on, he styled himself as Franz I, Emperor of Austria, not exactly an upgrade, but a safer, more centralized throne. Still, even as head of the new Austrian Empire, Franz remained committed to a form of governance best described as timid absolutism. He avoided innovation, loathed liberalism, and feared nationalism like a contagious disease. His court became a fortress of reactionary policies. Censorship was absolute. University lectures were monitored by spies, books were banned. And the great flowering of Enlightenment thought that had once animated the courts of Europe was, under Franz, stuffed back into the drawer and nailed shut. Franz wasn't tyrannical. He didn't persecute with the zeal of a despot. Rather, his reign was like a bureaucratic fog damp, colorless and heavy. He believed the only good subjects were quiet ones, and the best form of progress was none at all. His chief architect of policy was the notorious Prince Clemens von Metternich, the ultimate conservative diplomat. Under their guidance, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 redrew the borders of Europe after Napoleon's defeat and tried to resurrect the old order with a stern face and a glittering ballroom. Franz hosted the affair like a somber motto d', ensuring everything went smoothly so long as no one dared utter words like freedom, rights, or change. Throughout the rest of his reign, Franz resisted even the mildest reforms. Industrialization crept into other parts of Europe, but the Habsburg lands lagged behind deliberately. Ethnic tensions simmered between Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, and Italians within his sprawling empire, but Franz preferred to suppress their identities rather than address their demands. He kept the lid tight, hoping the pot wouldn't boil. He ruled until 1835, a long reign of nearly half a century. And though he presided over monumental changes in Europe, Franz himself changed very little. He began his career as the Holy Roman Emperor and ended it as a footnote in Austria's slow stumble toward irrelevance. To many, Franz was the embodiment of ceremonial monarchy, rigid, joyless, and painfully cautious. He wasn't incompetent, but he was uninspired. He didn't ruin his empire, but neither did he renew it. He believed the greatest virtue of a ruler was to stand still while the world moved, and in doing so, he let others rewrite the rules. His personal life mirrored his politics. He fathered 13 children, wore outdated uniforms long after they were fashionable, and insisted on rituals that even his courtiers found exhausting. While the rest of Europe embraced steam, printing, and progress, Franz remained a human museum exhibit, preserved in mothballs. Franz II's greatest legacy may be that he ended something rather than built something. He oversaw the final breath of an empire once thought eternal and replaced it with a monarchy that was already obsolete upon creation. In many ways, he was a deeply dull bridge between the medieval past and the modern future. He did not storm across history with banners and armies. He shuffled through it in ceremonial slippers. And for that, Franz II remains not just a boring monarch, but one of the most accidentally symbolic. A man who ruled during the fall of an ancient order, but never dared to look down and see how far it had already collapsed. In the long procession of monarchs who governed without actually governing, Charles IV of Spain occupies a unique place. He was not a tyrant, nor a reformer, nor even a tragic figure. Instead, he was a man whose idea of kingship was to hand over the job and focus on his true passions: hunting, music, and royal comfort. His reign, spanning from 1788 to 1808, was defined not by what he did, but by what he allowed others to do in his name. Charles IV inherited the Spanish crown from his father, Charles III, one of the few Enlightenment-era Bourbon monarchs who managed to modernize Spain's economy, reign in the church, and push science and rationality into the corridors of power. His son, unfortunately, was a dimmer light. From early childhood, Charles IV displayed no intellectual appetite, no political acumen, and very little energy for anything beyond falconry, fiddles, and fine food. Still, he was dutiful in the sense that he accepted his role and promptly handed the responsibility to someone else. That someone else was Manuel de Godoy, a royal guard of minor nobility who, thanks to a combination of good looks, ambition, and the favor of Queen Maria Luisa, ascended rapidly through the ranks to become prime minister. His relationship with the Queen was a matter of courtly gossip. Accusations of an affair swirled constantly. And while never formally proven, the ease with which Godoy rose to power points to a deeper influence. Charles IV, either unaware or uncaring, granted Godoy almost total control over Spanish governance. The king, uninterested in statecraft, gave the prime minister free rein over foreign policy, taxation, church relations, and colonial administration. As Spain teetered on the edge of crisis, economically stagnant, politically brittle, and diplomatically isolated, Godoy made bold moves. Bold, but often catastrophically miscalculated. One of his most infamous decisions was to align Spain with revolutionary France, a move that horrified the conservative Spanish nobility and clergy. After all, France had executed its king and queen relatives of the Spanish crown and now threatened monarchies across Europe. But Godoy, in a gamble to stay relevant and appease Napoleon, pushed Charles into an alliance that quickly turned disastrous. The king's response? Silence. As Spain bled money and morale in a series of failed military campaigns, Charles IV kept to his gardens and orchestras. Even as public discontent rose, he trusted Godoy implicitly, ignoring advisors and nobles who begged him to remove the unpopular minister. As the French Revolution evolved into the Napoleonic Empire, Spain became increasingly entangled in its chaos. After vacillating between alliances with France and Britain, Godoy backed Napoleon's invasion of Portugal, allowing French troops to cross Spanish territory. It was supposed to be a power play. Instead, it became a Trojan horse. The French army did not leave Spain. Instead, Napoleon occupied key Spanish cities, including Madrid, under the guise of aiding the Spanish king. The Spanish people were outraged. Protests erupted. The nobility grew restless. And still, Charles IV remained curiously inactive, appearing more confused than concerned. Then came the coup not by Napoleon, but from within the royal family. In 1808, Charles's own son, Ferdinand, led a palace revolt against both his father and Godoy. Under pressure from military officers and public opinion, Charles IV abdicated not with a fight, but with a whimper. He fled to Napoleon, hoping the French emperor would restore him. What followed was one of the most humiliating chapters in Spanish royal history, the Bayonne Conference. Napoleon summoned both Charles IV and Ferdinand to France, where he played them against each other like pawns on a chessboard. After a series of private meetings and subtle threats, both father and son renounced their claims, and Napoleon placed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. Spain erupted into revolt. The Peninsular War had begun. While Spanish patriots took to the streets to fight the French occupation, the former king, Charles IV, lived in comfortable exile, first in France, then in Italy, doing what he had always done best, avoiding responsibility. He would never regain his throne, nor would he seem to want it. He spent his final years with Queen Maria Luisa, visiting churches, tending to his health, and reminiscing about the good old days of royal banquets and hunting parties. He died in 1819, largely forgotten by the Europe that had long moved on without him. Charles IV is an easy target for historians, not because of scandals or cruelty, but because of his vacuum of will. He was a monarch so detached that even in the face of national collapse, he could not summon the interest to act. His passivity allowed a poorly qualified minister to run the country into the ground. His inaction invited foreign invasion. His inability to lead forced his own son to revolt. And in the end, he left behind a Spain in flames. But what truly cements Charles IV's place in the hall of boring monarchs to just his failure to lead the strange calm with which he watched everything unravel. No drama, no resistance, no reflection. Just quiet dinners, mechanical clocks, and violin recitals as the Spanish Empire buckled under foreign boots. He was not a villain. He was not a reformer. He was not even present in the ways a king should be. Charles IV was the monarch who ruled by delegation and distraction, a figurehead, who let his prime minister do the thinking while the nation sank around him. And in that sense, he wasn't just boring. He was dangerously forgettable. If monarchy were judged solely by presence, Louis XVIII of France would have scored high. He was certainly present large, physically immobile, and politically inert. But if you looked beyond the polished shoes and powdered wigs of post-Napoleonic France, you'd find a man who came to power not on a wave of glory or inspiration, but through a historical accident. His reign first restored in 1814, interrupted by Napoleon in 1815, and resumed until 1824 was as anticlimactic as a drum roll with no cymbal crash. Louis XVIII wasn't a man of grand speeches, stirring reforms, or even decisive acts. He was, quite literally, a monarch whose greatest skill was sitting still both metaphorically and physically. France didn't so much welcome him back as tolerate his existence, the way one might tolerate a distant uncle who once owned the house and now insists on sleeping in the guest room. Born in 1755 as the brother of Louis XVI, Louis Stanislas Xavier spent the early part of his life immersed in court rituals and noble excesses. He had opinions, often conservative ones, but no real responsibilities, which suited him fine. Then came the French Revolution, and his entire world was chopped to pieces, quite literally in his brother's case. Louis fled France in 1791 and began a 23-year exile that would transform him into a sort of royal ghost, a pretender without a throne, wandering through Europe, promising stability in return for a crown he hadn't yet earned. He styled himself as Louis XVIII after the death of his nephew, the imprisoned Louis XVII, a child king who never ruled. But no armies followed Louis XVIII, no uprisings in his name. He was largely ignored by history until Napoleon. Bonaparte was finally defeated in 1814, with France exhausted by war and revolution, and the European powers desperate to restore some semblance of the old order. Louis was dusted off and gently deposited on the throne. From the moment he returned, Louis made it clear he would not rock the boat. He accepted the Charter of 1814, a constitutional compromise that preserved many revolutionary reforms, including civil rights, legal equality, and religious freedom. But he accepted them with the enthusiasm of a man swallowing castor oil. His courtiers dreamed of absolutism reborn. Louis gave them something else entirely, a cautious, bloated figurehead whose motto seemed to be, "Don't touch anything." His strategy was simple: survive. Avoid provoking the ultra-royalists who wanted vengeance. Avoid upsetting the liberals who wanted reform. Avoid confronting the Bonapartists still loyal to the exiled emperor. And above all, avoid doing too much. In this, Louis succeeded marvelously. But in 1815, his delicately balanced boredom was shattered when Napoleon escaped Elba and returned to France. As Napoleon marched triumphantly toward Paris, Louis fled once again, no resistance, no speeches, just a hasty departure. This brief interruption, known as the 100 Days, ended with Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo. The Allies reinstalled Louis, this time with more suspicion and more soldiers, and he resumed his previous position as the king who didn't quite govern. The second restoration was less stable than the first. The royalists, emboldened by vengeance, launched the White Terror, executing Bonapartist supporters and purging the military and civil service. Louis, ever cautious, allowed it to happen while pretending to frown. He wanted peace but refused to enforce it. He wanted moderation but never imposed it. He reigned like a sponge, absorbing pressure but offering nothing back. Louis XVIII's physical condition echoed his politics. By the time he resumed the throne, he was obese, ravaged by gout, and almost entirely immobile. He spent most of his time being carried from room to room, propped up by attendants, and hiding behind privacy screens. His corpulence became a symbol of a regime bloated by inaction. His ministers made decisions, his family feuded, his people simmered. And Louis sat, quite literally, doing as little as possible. He did, on occasion, make small gestures toward balance. He dismissed hardline ultra-royalists from government, appointed moderate prime ministers, and tried unsuccessfully to calm the fires ignited by years of upheaval. But he lacked the energy, charisma, or authority to truly unite France. The revolution had severed France's connection to the idea of sacred monarchy, and Louis XVIII never found a replacement idea. He was not beloved like a father figure, nor feared like a ruler. He was, at best, tolerated. He died in 1824, almost exactly 10 years after his first restoration. There were no mass public mourning parades, no weeping in the streets. He was succeeded by his brother Charles X, a reactionary monarch who swiftly undid what little stability Louis had maintained. Within 6 years, Charles would be overthrown in the July Revolution of 1830. Louis XVIII's legacy is not one of glory, reform, or strength. It is, instead, a masterclass in political stagnation. He represented the last gasp of Bourbon legitimacy, a king who came back from exile only to sit quietly, sigh occasionally, and politely decline the opportunity to matter. Where Napoleon burned through Europe with vision and violence, Louis XVIII moved at a crawl, encased in lace and protocol. He governed like a curtain-heavy, decorative, and always in the way. He wasn't a king of the people. He wasn't even a king of the aristocracy. He was a king of pause and empire on standby. There's something almost admirable in how thoroughly Louis avoided greatness. He didn't overreach. He didn't inspire revolt. He didn't even leave behind scandal. He was simply there, sitting motionless in a country desperate for direction. And so, in the gallery of the most boring monarchs who ever lived, Louis XVIII's portrait hangs slightly crooked on the wall, its subject slouched in velvet, powdered wig askew, eyes half-lidded, waiting patiently for history to pass him by. If the annals of boring monarchs were a grand, dusty tome, Frederick I of Sweden would be the final, almost comical footnote. King so disengaged and indifferent that his reign was less a chapter of history and more a long, sleepy yawn. His story is not of battles won or laws passed, but of a man who quite literally forgot he was king, proving that sometimes the most astonishing historical figures are the ones who do ... almost nothing. Frederick was born in 1676 in the small German principality of Hesse-Kassel, a minor noble far from the icy shores of Scandinavia. His ascent to the Swedish throne was not the result of conquest or ambition, but a matter of royal marriage and dynastic accident. In 1720, after the tumultuous reign of his predecessor Charles XII, Sweden sought stability, and Frederick married to Hedvig Sophia, sister of Charles XII, was elected king. But king was a title Frederick wore like an oversized, cloak-heavy, awkward, and ultimately more symbolic than functional. Unlike his predecessors, who had been warriors or reformers, Frederick was neither. He was a man of quiet temperament, limited interest in politics, and a lifestyle that favored comfort over duty. His court was calm, but more because of indifference than order. Most tellingly, Frederick was more interested in hunting dogs and astronomy than in running an empire. His fascination with celestial bodies reportedly distracted him from pressing matters of state. Legend even has it that Frederick once missed an entire parliamentary session because he was studying the stars, leaving his ministers to manage the affairs of Sweden as best they could. The Swedish government during Frederick's reign operated largely without the king's input. The real power was held by the Riksdag of the Estates, a parliamentary body that, in the absence of royal authority, gradually expanded its influence. Frederick's passivity essentially handed Sweden's governance to this nascent form of representative government, an accidental abdication without formal abdication. Frederick's reign coincided with a period known as the Age of Liberty in Sweden. Rare moment in European history when parliamentary power flourished at the expense of monarchy. While other European kings tightened their grip, Frederick unwittingly loosened his, retreating into a quiet life of personal hobbies and social leisure. Despite, or perhaps because of his lack of engagement, Frederick lived a long and uneventful reign from 1720 to 1751. He neither plunged Sweden into war nor enacted major reforms. Sweden's international influence waned, but domestic peace endured. If only because the king was too disinterested to cause trouble, his personal life was equally uneventful. Though married to Hedvig Sophia, Frederick fathered no legitimate heirs, and after her death, he married Louisa Ulrica of Prussia, a woman of far stronger will and ambition who effectively overshadowed her husband. Louisa Ulrica was the power behind the throne in Frederick's later years, often acting as the de facto ruler while Frederick remained a passive figurehead. Frederick's near-forgettable reign challenges traditional narratives about monarchy. He was neither a tyrant nor a hero. He was a king who simply forgot the responsibilities that came with his crown, or, perhaps more accurately, never really cared for them in the first place. His reign is a fascinating study in how monarchies can sometimes survive, through the sheer absence of force rather than the presence of leadership. By the time of his death in 1751, Frederick I had become something of a historical curiosity, a monarch whose biggest achievement was his ability to do almost nothing without the kingdom collapsing. His legacy was not in grand reforms or wars, but in a profound stillness, an invisibility cloak that wrapped around his reign and smothered drama. In a world filled with kings who burned bright and fell hard, Frederick I was the steady, slow-burning candle that simply flickered quietly until it went out. His reign reminds us that history is not always shaped by bold actions or stirring speeches. Sometimes it is shaped by the silent weight of absence. And so, the story of the most boring monarchs comes full circle from infants who never ruled, through kings who let others decide, to emperors who watched empires dissolve, and finally to Frederick I, the monarch who nearly forgot he wore a crown. The throne was his by right, but the kingdom was ruled in spite of him.